Susan Wright is a murderer convicted of the first-degree murder of her husband in 2004. He had been stabbed 193 times and was buried under the patio in a shallow grave in their back garden. Susan Wright is also known as Blue-Eyed Butcher. Susan Wright was released on parole on the 30th of December 2020. On January 13, 2003, Susan Wright tied her husband Jeff to the bed and stabbed him 193 times all over his body. 7 of the stab wounds were concentrated in the groin area. She used 2 different knives during the attack on Jeff and later dragged his body into their back garden. Susan buried the body in a dug that Jeff had dug whilst doing work on their garden. She later repainted their bedroom to cover up her crime, destroying blood-stain evidence at the Susan Wright crime scene. On January 14, 2003, she filed a domestic abuse report so that she could get a restraining order against her husband, even though he was already dead at the time. Susan Wright confessed to the murder of her husband to her attorney on January 18, 2003. She confessed after their dog dug up his body and she knew she could no longer conceal what she had done. Susan had invited her attorney, Neil Davis, to her home in order to confess to him and seek legal counsel. Davis reported the crime to the district attorney's office, informing them of her confession and the location of the body. Police collected evidence from the Susan Wright crime scene, including bottles of bleach and a blood-stained mattress. The press dubbed her as the Blue-Eyed Butcher, due to the violence of the crime and her appearance with blue eyes. Susan Wright pleaded not guilty to her husband Jeff Wright's murder. Her defense was that the murder was a result of self-defense after years of physical and emotional abuse. The prosecution, however, believed that she had persuaded her husband to be tied to the bed with the intention to murder him. They believed that Susan had murdered Jeff for a $200,000 life insurance policy. Their bed was brought into the courtroom for a demonstration of the crime, and the prosecution claimed that her tears were fake. Susan testified as part of her defense. She told jurors that her husband was high on cocaine and was being violent with her. She claimed that she had no choice to stab him as she was in fear of her life and afraid for their children. Susan also claimed that she couldn't stop stabbing him through fear that he would get the knife from her and stab her. Susan's mother testified that she had seen bruises on Susan on previous occasions. After nearly 6 hours of deliberations, the jurors declared that Susan Wright was guilty of the murder of her husband Jeff Wright. On March 4, 2004, Susan Wright was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The first appeal was rejected by the Court of Appeal and Susan's conviction was upheld. A further appeal in 2008 featured new testimony from Jeff's ex-fiancée Misty, who told the court Jeff had been violent during their relationship. A new sentencing hearing was granted in 2009 following a successful appeal. The court decided that her counsel was ineffective during the sentencing part of her trial. In November 2010, her sentence was reduced to 20 years in prison before the possibility of parole. Yes, Susan Wright is out of jail. Susan Wright was released on the 30th of December 2020 after being granted parole in a parole hearing in July. She was granted parole and is due to be under strict supervision, undertake anger control training, counseling, wear a GPS monitor and undertake gainful employment as part of the terms of her parole terms. Some parts on her parole conditions will last 3 months and some of the supervision will last until 2024. Susan Wright had been denied parole twice since becoming eligible for parole. She was denied in 2014 and again in 2017 due to the violent nature of the offense. The Blue-Eyed Butcher was due for review for parole again in 2020 and her projected release date was 2024, meaning she was released 4 years earlier than expected. Jeff and Susan Wright married in 1998 after meeting in 1997 in a restaurant where Susan was working as a waitress. Susan Wright has 2 children, son Bradley and daughter Kaylee, with Jeff. After the murder of their father and imprisonment of their mother Susan Wright, the children went to live with Jeff's parents.